the silver bullet to building great relationships, but because there's shared suffering, there's, the accountability, there's all these other kinds of things. But there is no doubt a role if I can see the good in myself, because as humans, we're really good at seeing like our own weaknesses, right? And then we're really good at seeing the weaknesses in other people, right? So if we train our mind to see the good in ourselves, to see perseverance, integrity, humility, fairness, forgiveness, if we see those things in ourselves and we see them in other people, we now have the common vocabulary to see ourselves more clearly and to understand other people better. That gives us the language and the understanding to be able to build stronger relationships. But I would just sum it up by saying like, yeah, you're like, not everyone's going to, sometimes I go in and I talk to people like, all right, man, I don't need this, like leadership, or all this, soft stuff. But I think the people over time are coming to the realization that, as we've talked about at the beginning of the conversation, that relationships are not just all about like this soft stuff, right? But it does boil down to, I think a lot of it is how well do you understand other people? Because a relationship is two-way. It's not just like you can know yourself until till the cows come home. If you don't learn how to see and understand and see the good in other people, then you are going to by default see their weaknesses and their flaws. And it's really hard to build a strong relationship with someone when you see a lot of good in yourself, right? But you don't understand who somebody else is.
Yeah. Side note, more out of curiosity and fun than anything. You say soft stuff, and I've heard it said a lot, and I might have even been guilty of using the term, right? But then you immediately move to the truth of relationships are fucking hard. And having these conversations is really tough. Particularly like when we're under the pump, it's like, damn, that is one of the hardest things you're going to do as a coach. Sit down with a player and like connect when he's just played shit and you screwed up the play call that was perfect. Like, that's really hard. So why do we call it soft stuff if it's really hard?
Yeah, I got a better answer than I do. I don't have a good answer.
It feels hard, but I think it's not just hard to do emotionally, but it's also like there's a hard physics behind it, right? There actually is a math there that I think you're tapping into by saying, look, no, it's not magic. It does feel magic when it happens because we're in the realm of emotions, right? Emotions always feel really powerful and mysterious. Why do I suddenly feel happy or angry? But there's actually sort of some physics and some math here where it's like, no. If you express vulnerability to someone, if you say, I'm sorry that I did this, or I think I made this mistake, it can create really predictable responses. And so this idea that, like, we understand with our physical body, right? That if you're going to go get stronger, you need to go to the gym and you need to feel pain. And when you feel that pain, you're going to have this response where your body's going to get stronger. Your muscles are bigger. If you don't feel that pain, you will not get stronger. And I think we're starting to learn that in emotional language too, in the emotional world. Relationships, while it is hard to build relationships, there's a physics underneath it that really is rooted in vulnerability and self-reflection and understanding yourself and understanding others. And if you can figure that out, if you can actually lean into that experience and to those emotions and be willing to feel that emotional burn, just like when you feel a physical burn, it's like, oh no, this is actually a good thing, right? Pleasant. We didn't always know that about exercise. We used to think it was bad. Like you could die if you exercise too hard. And that's sort of partly true, but it's not totally true. So this idea that the pain is the gain, and you start to realize, no. When I express my vulnerability as a leader, when I really try to understand another person, it feels painful and weird, but that's exactly what I would need it to feel in order to create growth.
Yeah. I can vouch for the fact that the belief of dying from exercise still exists. I went for a run the other day and was very close to passing away. But that's because it was my first run in probably a few weeks, maybe longer. And it's a bit like that when it comes to relationships, right? I had a mentor who was one of the first people that introduced me to culture work, Ray McLean. Speaking of books, really, this guy started me on the path to where we are now, where I am now, but particularly in this area. Any Given Team by Ray McLean, really worth a read because he basically does this work day to day with some of the best teams in Australia and started out working in the Air Force in Australia, doing leadership development by dropping people in the middle of the bush in groups of 5 or 6 and saying, work it out. And a lot of it led to these sort of discoveries that one of the models he used would be he would take a pyramid, but he'd flip it on its head and say, these are the levels of communication. At the top is where most people are. That's why it's wide. And at the bottom is where very few people get to. And at the top is like grunt. You walk past someone, you live in the same building, you're like, what's up? You barely say a word, but you are communicating. There's just not much going on. And then the next level is, we'll talk about stuff and things. Like, did you see the basketball game last night? How about Donald Trump? Like, you talk about things that, maybe Trump's not a great example, but things that aren't really emotionally invested, right? It's just pretty safe stuff. Then we can talk about other people, because if I know Mike and Dan knows Mike, then Dan and I can talk about Mike, but it's still relatively safe. because Mike's not involved in the conversation. So there's no identity crisis or worry about hurting anyone. And then he draws a big, thick line above the last two levels. And the next one is talking about Mike to Mike. So we're going to have a conversation. And the last one is about, I'm going to talk about me and Mike with Mike, because that's a whole nother level of like vulnerability. And like, this could really hurt one or both of us. And that thick line after the third level is talking about whether you say going below the line or taking a breath and getting underwater. Like the ability to go down there once is like me going for a run the other day. It hurts because I haven't done it in a while and it might screw up and I might have to call it before I'm finished. But if I do that every day, when I really need to go down there, it's going to be much easier to get done.
Right. And that gets into totally, and that gets into, about why it's, two things, to what Dan said and what you just said, Patty. Number one, this is why it's so hard, like to be able to get there, like especially those initial times. I mean, I've spent some time with Brene Brown, kind of the queen of vulnerability, several times at West Point, before she got really big. This is like 2012.
Before TikToks.
Yeah. Yeah. So she, I literally spent at 45 minutes to an hour talking to her. Like literally, she calls it like a vulnerability hangover. The next day you literally feel much like, and so what Dan said really resonated, the idea of framing it up and comparing it to the physical hurt that you feel, we all know if you want to get stronger, you want to get faster, you got to go out there and you got to do those 800 repeats or whatever it might be. But it's pretty interesting to think about it in terms of that same way, emotionally and all that, because going back to my point about it's hard. It's just not something oh yeah, man, can't wait to go out there and just lean in my vulnerability and knowing that yes, it is a vulnerable place to be, but then also literally you don't know how it's going to go at the end. And then that next day, you really feel, man, I'm exhausted. And that's how I found just talking to her for 45 minutes. Next day, I literally felt like I was just moving in slow motion because she pulled out some complicated stuff with combat rotations and all that stuff. So
I'm sure she's rapt to hear that you felt exhausted to talking to her. But it is a great example and a really true, I've heard you say earlier in the show a few times, Dan, everyone here has felt this or experienced it. I'd be amazed if most people can't say, yeah, I've had a conversation before that went deep below that line to we had to go underwater and hold our breath for a little bit. And that later that day or the next day, you didn't feel some repercussions from it. And I think it's a great example. So, Mike, you're saying that you can actually practice that and deliberately build that up as part of what you do with people?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be able to get there because the idea of just going there, kind of like you talk about a run, if you go for a 5-mile run once a month, it's never going to get any easier. It's never going to be something that you can eventually afford to,
Doesn't, I promise. I've been doing it 5 months in a row.
Yeah. So, you know, exactly the analogy resonates, right? But the idea of getting there more consistently and training it, right? Within our mind to be able to go there. But again, it requires a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of time and space. And then also just the knowledge to be able to know that you can do this, right? Because there's a lot of people who just, I catch myself sometimes be don't have the energy. Don't have the energy right now or the time.
I'm not a people person or whatever it might be. Yeah. Let me ask, what Mike's describing there as actual intervention exercises, or here's a program you can do, or here's a conversation template that can actually take you there, right? These things exist and people do apply them. Have you seen them organically in practice? Like you mentioned Pop as a living example of someone who was hard and then soft. Yeah. But in other areas, you also described some of the stuff that the Pink Panthers did as a split group of cells. But can you think of any other examples where you're this person was actually really good at teaching people or showing people, taking them by the hand and walking them through those sort of conversations?
I think modeling is really underrated as a tool, in the effect. I heard somebody put it this way. It's ideas and books don't change people. People change people. And we can all think of people in our lives. If we all closed our eyes right now and think of people who affected us, it's very easy to think of them. And a lot of us think, oh, what would they do in this situation? Right. And that ends up being this compass that lets you through you're in a tough situation. All of us do this little mental trick where we're oh, what would my Uncle Bob do? What would Commander so-and-so do? And it really is powerful, and it seems kind of woo-woo, but I think it speaks to the underrated power of presence and modeling. And that's to sort of connect back to some other threads we've talked about today. That's why that shared space and that is so important, because you're sort of modeling for each other how to be. I've seen the effect in my work with the Cleveland Indians. We have a mutual friend, Jay Hennessy, who came from the SEALs team and has been the head of leadership and development there for a while. I know he brought Mike in to speak to the group. And it's been super interesting over the last 2 years to see the effect Jay's presence and other people's presence has had on each other. It's contagious, it's sort of the way he leads and the way he communicates and the way he holds himself, gives everybody a really clear model on how to do that. And so to your original point, like, yeah, it's useful to have kind of a model or a reflected exercise. But man, if you can create the environment where you're filling your windshield with really clear people who are doing this stuff every day, that's incredibly powerful, not for just individuals, but for whole groups. That's the oldest software there is, right? Like watching other people, getting motivated by them and copying them. Actually, learning how they think. It's one thing to be given a step-by-step bit of instructions, but a real mentor, and you guys have mentioned several mentors, the power of mentorship is super powerful. And the power of a mentor is that we can access how they think about stuff. Well, how would they think about this? How would they behave? How would they feel about this? I think that's incredibly powerful.